Tell us the significance of this new development.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's a scary headline to see, but the fact that this is two people that were in close contact, the sort of situation where you might, sort of assume would be the most likely kind of transmission to happen, that's pretty reassuring. It's not like we're seeing, cases pop out of nowhere. This is something I imagine the CDC was already watching. They're looking at people who have traveled to China, those close to them. So I wouldn't say this should dramatically alter anyone's opinion of how serious this is.
I mean, for those who live in the United States, we're particularly focused on what happens in the United States. But did we basically understand people could transmit it to other people in China, for example? Is that a development?
We already understood that's what's happening.
See.
Yeah, so this can be transmitted via droplets. The question is how easily that happens. That's still open, whether it can happen when people aren't showing symptoms. But we are getting the sense that is something that happens with some frequency. The fact that this is not so severe might be a potential avenue for further transmission. So on one hand, you're sort of reassured by the fact that the death rate isn't that high, but the fact that it isn't so serious means that it could go pretty far without people actually noticing too much, which is a little scary.
This is an important development, particularly important for the people directly involved, goodness knows, but maybe not as important as you suggested some other possibilities. With the WHO reconsidering now, as I understand, whether this is a global health emergency, not just in China. How important is the question of asymptomatic transmission? Because we've heard various things about that. The Chinese at one point said it did happen. We said we weren't sure that had been confirmed.
So that is tremendously important because it'll read through to whether you have these sort of isolated transmissions within other countries, like we just saw here, where it's people that have traveled, a spouse, someone really close to them, or if there are people, walking around shedding virus right now that don't know that they have it, and potentially leading to, a greater spread in countries outside of China. So far, it's been pretty confined in just about every country outside of China, and I think that's why you have the WHO only now trying to make that determination once again, whether it's a global emergency or, again, just something that's of most concern in China.
Max, what as a practical matter turns on whether the WHO declares that or not? I mean, are there funds that get released? Are there actions taken by governments? Or what happens if they decide that?
So the biggest shift, the biggest consequence is that the WHO will get more power to sort of collectively direct government responses, to have a more standardized response, to demand, data in a certain format. At the end of the day, if they do end up declaring that, I would caution people to not take that as a sign to panic or something. It's just acknowledging that there's been enough of a spread, there's been person-to-person transmission in enough countries that it's worth coordinating a global response more directly by this organization that does have a lot of experience with these sort of global epidemics before.
Do we have a sense, do you have a sense, whether we are getting the information out of China that we wanted? When it first happened, people gave them a lot of credit for disclosing the basic formation of the DNA, disclosed that. But then there were reports after that we're not getting as much information on mutation and some of the other issues. Do you have a sense whether they're really opening it up so that the scientists can know what's going on?
So you do hear sort of both sides. You saw the WHO press conference today. They sort of lavished praise on China for how rapidly they sequence the virus, how rapidly they're shared information and the information they're sharing on a daily basis. On the other hand, you have reports that early on in the process, China perhaps hoped that it could sort of limit the sort of information that got out, maybe try to take care of this early without creating sort of the global media firestorm that we're seeing now. It does seem to be a mixed bag, but the first kind of authority I trust is probably the WHO, and they seem to be indicating that, especially relative to the SARS outbreak, other outbreaks in the past, the level of transparency and information does seem to be pretty good from China.
On the United States side, we had President Trump yesterday sort of designating a task force, as it were, led by the HHS Secretary, Alex Azar. What can they do? Alex Azar thus far has said, we think it's a big problem in China. It's not an immediate risk to U.S. citizens.
And I would think that's a pretty accurate assessment based on what we know now. But they can, up screening at different airports. We already saw that happen recently. And then further try to direct the medical response, the effort to come up with a potential vaccine. Already some work on that, obviously very early. And we're unlikely to see human tests or let alone something at production scale for a long time to come. But, to try and move that along as rapidly as possible in the case that this does sort of go on for months and spread further in the United States and elsewhere.